Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the SOMM TV podcast. My name is Jason Wise. On today's podcast, I'm going to speak with Claire Copey, and we are going to cover wines from two countries that we are considering the term the Holy Land. This is a podcast we've been waiting to do for quite a while, and these two countries, Israel and Armenia, produce some of the great wines of the world, and I would venture to guess many of you listening have not had wines from these two places. Their history alone makes it worth trying, but the quality is one of the things that's going to really make you come back to them. So before we get started, I do want to say you're probably pretty close here to Christmas and the end of gift giving. And I want to say SOMMTV.com is the gift you can get right now for anybody in your life that likes stories, wine, and food. Go to SOMMTV.com and get it for $49.99 for an entire year as a gift. So Claire, you just got back from Israel.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, and I'm recently back from Armenia.
Yeah.
I think we both had our proverbial lives changed by these two trips.
Absolutely. 100%.
Yeah, and there's a reason that we singled out on these two countries. Israel's an easy one because of the intersection of most major Western religions in this particular place. Armenia might surprise people, and I'll get into why that's such an important place in this conversation. I was there in Armenia filming Cup of Salvation, my upcoming follow-up to the SOMM series, and you were in Israel filming a episode that's coming as part of a travel show to SOMM TV early 2023. So people are going to want to look out for that. Both of those, actually.
Yeah.
All right. So let's start this in a way. I mean, whenever you start talking about wine, religion, and kind of all of the things that go around that, you have to talk about where wine came from. And I find this particular topic to be more controversial than it needs to be. You know, there are certain countries that really pin their identity on wine came from this place or grapes came from this place, and others who don't get any credit at all and might deserve much more. And so, if you don't mind, I'm just going to do a couple minutes kind of on the wine we drink. And I want to start it with everything, or at least almost everything you drink. Champagne, Pinot Grigio, Pinot Noir, Cabernet, all of these wines are the same species, Vitis vinifera. It is one single vine that morphed and turned into so many different styles, so many different grapes, so many different kinds of wine. And I think that is often lost in remembering how important it is to know it's the same thing and it's been manipulated by humans for millennia. And so I was recently on an archaeological dig. This is an amazing flex for me to say, but it's true. And this was in the Caucasus Mountains. And the Caucasus Mountains, most scientists believe, and historians and geneticists, this is the birthplace of the vine that we use to make everything. And there's been a big question as to where it came from. What country is actually the foundation? Well, I have news for all of the countries or people that have an association with them. There were no countries in the Neolithic period. So we're talking about 8,000 or so years ago. There were no countries. So people who are listening to this podcast who, you know, they want to say Georgia or Armenia or Iran was the birthplace of wine, I have news for you. Those countries did not exist. There were groups of people that migrated back and forth, but there's something really special about this area. It's both isolated and a crossroads. And so it created an environment that had certain weather patterns. It had an amazingly rich diversity of plant material. And it also had what I would call a very tough topography. So certain plants did very well there. And one of them was a wild plant called Vitis vinifera that we have named that in the recent modern times. It was a wild vine, and it sort of just grew in places, rocky outcrops and things like that. Now, there's something very special about this vine that needs to be mentioned. Every year, it dies, essentially. And all the leaves fall off and all the fruit falls off, and it appears to be dead for quite a long time. And then it comes back to life. And it's important to note that the areas I'm talking about, which are modern-day Armenia and Georgia, they're not covered in a ton of forest, especially where I'm talking about. And vines themselves would have been what people would have seen and saw this death and rebirth. And many think there's a chance organized religion itself came from the observation that vines would die and come back. And this is a really fascinating thing because the idea of many religions, going back to the Babylonians, going back to ancient Persia, certainly the Greeks, definitely the Jews, definitely without a question, the Christians, there is an element of rebirth. And the idea that something can die and come back to life fuels the idea that there is a life after death. And so, that tangent aside, grapes played an incredible part in the fact that people would wait for a certain time, they would come back to life. And they started picking these berries. And anybody who knows anything about alcohol, you know, it's not really hard to make. Alcohol alcohol can almost make itself if you really tried. If you were to take a bunch of grapes, and I don't advise you do this because it'll be a hangover central, but if you were to take a bunch of grapes and put them in a bucket, let them sit, probably what would happen is yeast on the grapes would interact with the juice that's coming out of just the weight of the grapes, and they would start to ferment. So likely what happened was humans discovered alcohol. Nobody invented wine. I want to make that very clear because there's this idea that wine was invented by people, and that's about as preposterous as an idea as anything. Wine and alcohol was discovered by ancient peoples. And imagine, Claire, now we can go to the bar and we can get a shot of Jaeger, or we can get a beer, or get a wine, and that buzz that sets in, we know what's going to happen. We understand we have to get an Uber afterwards.
Yeah, but God willing.
In the ancient world, you'd probably drink some of this, liquid, and you would look up at the sky and you'd have this buzz that came upon, and you'd probably do what most of us did in our dorm rooms in college, and you would think you were thinking deeper. And so there's this idea that religion and the idea of the afterlife and the idea of where do we go when we die and what's above us, alcohol certainly aided in that. So that stuff is important to keep in mind when you think about the birthplace of wine and its connection to religion. The countries that we're talking about, Claire and I, we've isolated down to Armenia and Israel for two reasons. Israel and Judaism is probably one of the most well-known Western religions to use wine in service. And Armenia was the first Christian nation. And there's a very, very strong argument that the first winemaking on any real scale, so what I would call a winery, not one person making wine, not the discovery of alcohol, but
the industry
of any kind of making it in more than 4 or 5 pots, took place in Armenia, in this crossroads of the Caucasus Mountains. And so let's talk first, Claire, about Israel. Because what happened when humans discovered these grapes and discovered the usage of alcohol is they carried it with them. And we should say that out of all plants, the vine is probably best suited to be transported from one place to another, because anybody who's been around a vineyard and you see people doing clippings or they're pruning their vineyards, they're cutting something called budwood. And budwood is a sort of dormant living plant material that if you take that and you travel, say, 50 miles, 100 miles, and you stick that in the ground at the right time of the year, it's going to grow. And it's going to be the exact same vine that you took it from. So you can plant a vine 2 ways. One is from seed, and the other is from using this budwood. If you do it from seed, you honestly don't know what you're going to get. And that's part of how a lot of these mutations happened, and you got all these different kinds of grapes. But budwood itself is a way to spread it. So when people traveled through the Caucasus Mountains into all of these places, and one of the first places they would have gone to would be modern-day Israel, Lebanon, Syria, they stuck this budwood in the ground, and they started growing grapes on a larger scale. And Israel's important to start with. Claire, you just got back from Israel. What does Israel look like? What's its topography like?
It's for it being such a small area, it's about the size of New Jersey, which kind of blew my mind when you think about that. Because you think about this ancient land being the size of this very small, much less cooler state. Sorry, New Jersey. But you get there, and it's really amazing just, that variation in such a small area. First of all, I live in Southern California, as you do. And honestly, Israel reminded me a lot of Southern California. In that variation in a small area, you have in the southern half of Israel, which I didn't really get into quite as much, you have the Negev, which is desert. So pretty much all of southern Israel is this desert. You get a lot of that desert land, though, heading up north. And then it gets more and more mountainous as you head up north, up into the Golan Heights. As you're heading up through the Judean hills, there is desert, there are forests, there are these mountains. So there's a huge range that you can play with there, which then, of course, leads to a huge range and different, really, really cool wines.
Yeah, that's we're going to get to what they're growing, but from an ancient standpoint, what do you think wine was like in Israel pre? It's easy to imagine it post Christianity, because I think many people, it's ingrained that when you think about religion, you think about communion, or you think about the kosher roots of wine, and at least in the Western world. What do you think it was like pre Christianity? And I guess this would be kind of like pre Roman and in the Roman times.
Yeah. So when we get into like ancient Israeli wine, it was probably on the sweeter side if we're just talking about style. The first recorded dry table wine didn't really come about until the 1960s. But it was very popular. It was a very huge part of the culture, very tied into religion, as you talked about. The symbolism with rebirth, life, and death. It was used to illustrate a lot of religious ideals. People, even if you were planting vineyards in ancient Israel, you were exempt from military duty, even during times of war, which I think is awfully kind of them. But it was on this major trade route from Mesopotamia to one of the biggest empires in the world, Egypt. And the wines that were crafted in ancient Israel became very popular there. They were exported to Rome, but they were going to be on the sweeter side, as a lot of ancient wines were, simply because, they couldn't really control fermentation on the level that we can today to make a completely dry wine and ferment off all that sugar. But yeah, it was a huge, huge industry. King David was said to have this ginormous cellar, and he had to have a team to manage it. He had people on staff to suggest which wines he should have with his dinner, possibly the first real sommeliers in the world, which is pretty neat. And it hits its peak kind of around 70 CE. And there's a Jewish revolt in Jerusalem, and the Romans come in, completely annihilate the temple and the city almost. And the Jews were dispersed. They fled into some strongholds, including Masada, where King Herod had his summer palace, and I actually got to visit it. And they held out there for a few years until the Romans were able to penetrate it, and very, very dramatic ending up there in those hills above the Dead Sea. But yeah, the entire industry kind of collapsed. Then there's the Arab conquest in 600 CE, and as we know, there's a prohibition of alcohol with that religion. All those vineyards get uprooted. Then there's a small glimmer of hope around 1100 when the Crusades happen. And,
just for wine, a glimmer of hope for wine.
I know. I was going to say not so much for a lot of other things, but thank God for wine. And there were a couple hundred years there where vineyards were beginning to get planted again around Bethlehem and Nazareth, but then that gets squashed again when the Ottoman Empire conquests the area, and industry's out, completely out. And then you don't really hear about winemaking in Israel until the 1800s.
Yeah, this is going to be a purveying thing through this region, because back and forth, any one of the places we would talk about have been conquered, reconquered, changed, borders change. One of the really interesting things, and I think this relates directly to wine, are the many different groups of people that live in these places, especially mountainous areas. And anywhere where you have mountains, it's a pain in the ass to get to small localities in those places. And what that means is you have developments of very different cultures. You have different peoples. You have, I don't mean to get too geeky here, but very few of these people still exist today, in a pure form. You have Assyrians still living. You have, I would argue that the Jews are the same Jews that existed then because of having to go all over and then come back. And there's an element of that, but there's something interesting taking it back to Armenia. And we have to talk about Islam for just a second. Obviously, when Islam became a very, very powerful trading force and a religious force that swept through much of the Middle East, they don't do alcohol. Now, they were also, I should say, pioneers in distillation and fermentation, but it was often for things like perfume and other things. It was not for drinking. But some of the technologies that came out of especially southern Spain and places where Islam had taken root, that's where we get a lot of what you were talking about, controlling fermentation. A lot of the technology was actually strangely invented by the people who outlawed alcohol. And so it's an amazing conundrum. But Armenia is an incredibly fascinating place. Armenia shares with Israel that they were both conquered by the Romans. Armenia a little later than Israel due to the distance and due to the topography. But they were all conquered by the Romans eventually. And afterwards, what ended up happening in Israel, I don't know if you guys have ever heard this story, but there was a young man by the name of Jesus Christ who was born next to a bunch of goats, and he changed a few things. But what happened when Christianity happened, and it took things from many different religions. It took things like the rebirth having to do with Dionysus and things from the Roman and Greek religions. And then it also took so much from Judaism. And they took it a step further, where the Son of God, the representation of this person and the way that you would partake in being a part of this religion would be to consume wine as his blood. This is a real important element for wine traveling around the world, because it gave a reason when religions were trying to spread, and they were very trying very hard. It was not just Christianity, Islam, Zoroastrianism, which would be the religion prior to Islam in Iran. All of them required wine in their services. And for that to be the case meant that vines were planted for a purpose. And it wasn't just commerce, it wasn't sales, it was to have a spiritual connection. And so what happened in the chaos of the 300 years after Christ was born is that there was a big upheaval around the entire, you mentioned Egypt, all of these areas had a big upheaval, and there were a lot of other religions that were sort of taking root and falling apart. Now I think we would call some of them cults, but people were following a lot, and a lot of them had to do with alcohol. In Armenia, in the year 300, roughly 300, shortly after that, there was a man by the name of Gregory the Illuminator. And it was a pagan culture in Armenia. He was imprisoned, and they won a battle that he predicted, and they brought him out of this prison. And what ended up happening was they converted themselves to Christianity. And Armenia was the first nation in the world to become a Christian state. And why that's important to wine is that all of a sudden, the birthplace of wine became a place where they were growing tons and tons and tons of vines. And so they were doing this because they needed it for religious services, and then it became a vast part of the culture. And much like Israel, they were also conquered by a number of different people following there on the trade route, and the Silk Road kind of goes right through there. So everybody from the Mongols to the Turks to the Ottomans eventually to the Soviets, they have been pretty much occupied by everybody. Many of those did not want wine and did not want vines growing. So what happened during the Islamic time in Armenia is that most of those vines were taken out. Now, I know that this is a big history thing, and it's something that I think is very important to understand to see where we get. And we will get to why these wines are delicious and you should taste them and what they taste like. What ended up happening was you had a culture in Armenia and in Israel that were centered around growing, respecting, and harvesting vines to make wine. And then it was sort of chopped off. And so you lost, here in America, we think about Prohibition. We're like, oh my God, we had to lose this culture for a whole, from 1920 to 1930.
Years.
Yeah, it's like, oh my God. This
do that
was
for centuries.
hundreds and hundreds of years in different sustained periods for both of these places. And it was very, very, very traumatic to a long sustained industry of making wine. These religions did not disappear. Obviously, Christianity stayed in Armenia, or there would be no Armenians today. And same with Georgia. They were pretty much the only Christian nations that were able to stay in that area, surrounded by modern-day Azerbaijan, which is a Turkic Islamic country, Turkey itself, and to the north, you have the North Caucasus Mountains, which is a very foreign place to most Americans, but it's mostly Muslim, like Chechnya, and you're nearby Iraq and all of these different places, Syria. So, talking about Armenia, you have this element of when the Ottoman Empire falls post-World War I, and Armenia gets just a few years of becoming its own nation. And some vines did survive this whole process. People were making them for religious things. There was not an industry, and they started to try to ramp it back up. And then what happens? Well, the Soviets moved in. And when the Soviets came in, you have this really fascinating thing that happened with communism, where basically they made a decision that each country under Soviet rule was going to have its own job. And there were all these vines in Armenia, and the Soviets decided they would make brandy. So Armenia made brandy, Georgia made wine, Crimea made wine, but Armenia's brandy became so famous in the Eastern world, it kind of became known as like the, it'd be like the Louis the 13th or something of the Soviet Russian world. But what that did is it didn't put a focus on individual grapes. It didn't put a focus on where to grow wine, because it didn't matter. When you're adding when you're fermenting something to a clarified spirit, like brandy,
you're not looking for terroir as much.
No, and so mostly it was on the flatlands, and there are vines that survived in the hills along these very first places I described at the beginning of the podcast that survived. And there's one grape in Armenia that is a literal miracle. It is called Areni, Areni. I can't wait for people to see Cup of Salvation. I'm not going to lie and say this doesn't have a big part of it. It's one of the world's most interesting grapes, and it might genetically be one of the very first grapes that's still in existence in a pure form. It's tremendous. And after the Soviet rule lifted, Armenia had to start over. And I think what's interesting about these two countries, we talk about the Holy Land, we talk about all of this history, they basically were startups. For Israel, it would have been the 1960s probably. Does that sound right?
When the 50s. Modern wave started happening again? End of the 1800s, but yeah, it didn't really kick in until mid-1900s.
Where anybody could actually get any of those wines outside of a small circumference around the area. But with Armenia, it was much later, because when the Soviet Union fell was when they all looked at each other. They had no electricity, no nothing. And they all looked at each other and said, can we get back to wine? And the Areni grape was right at the center of this. And so they're basically looking at the 1990s of starting what is the oldest continuous winemaking outside of maybe Georgia. And
it's crazy.
It's absolutely wild. So both of these countries. Now, with all of that said about the history and that, when you went to Israel, what were your preconceived ideas of what you were going to find from a wine standpoint?
I feel like everybody who asks me that question expects me to be like, no, I wasn't expecting any of it to be any good. Thought it was going to be crap. And I wasn't going into it jaded at all. I was very excited. I honestly walked in there very much expecting to be kind of, blown away by some of these wines. And I absolutely was. I was really surprised that grapes that sometimes can be divisive for me, I really, really enjoyed in Israel, or grapes that, get a lot of crap, such as Viognier or Merlot. I found beautiful expressions of both of those grapes in Israel. I thought that their native grape varieties were really, really cool. I was because those had been kind of abandoned for such a long time, and when the modern Israeli winemaking, as we kind of know it today, was taking off again, they were focusing a lot more on Bordeaux varietals, and then moving to Rhone varietals as well, the big sellers, the big hitters, because they wanted to get their wine out to as many people as possible, and Cabernet Sauvignon is pretty popular, whereas Argamon or Marawi or Debuchy is not. But those wines kicked just as much, ass as a lot of those grapes that we know and love already.
What were your thoughts? I tend to get a little snobby when I go to places like this, and I don't want to drink Cabernet. I don't want to drink Merlot. I want to drink whatever's from there. What were your thoughts on that? Is that, I'm probably looking at that wrong, but what were your thoughts when you got there and found Merlot?
I agree with you in the same sense, because it's like you've had so much of that and you're in a really, really cool, unique, special place with this insane history. Like, let's try the native stuff. But the Merlot was delicious. I was not upset at it. I was like, I'm here to embrace all of this. Let's see if there's anything distinct about this that makes it specifically Israeli Merlot. I was very, very open to the whole thing, to be honest.
It's the wrong attitude for me to have, because both of these places are incredible crossroads, pilgrims going back and forth. It would make sense that stuff would be brought into it and taken from it. So it's really the wrong attitude I would have to say, why can't you plant whatever, is the fancy of the times in a place like this? Armenia, on the flip side, is this kind of unicorn in the world where they don't have that, I'm going to say, pollution. They don't have that pollution at the moment, because they are working with things like Voskehat, which is like their preeminent white wine. Yeah, it's a delicious, high acid, really tasty white wine that they do. It's sparkling or white. And Arni and several others that I'm not going to try to pronounce because, as you can imagine, I'm not Armenian. But the wines there, to say that they were really good is one thing. They were really, really, really good. In fact, mind-blowing in some cases. But the fact that you can get them for like $16 to $20 a bottle, and in some cases so much less, is
they're so affordable.
Yeah, well, it's also one of these things that we always try to like hype on this podcast is, frankly, I don't care who you are. You're paying too much for wine. You're paying too much. Some people pay for the convenience of not having to look around, and that's a pain in the ass to do. But the wines of Armenia, this will change, by the way. They can't stay as inexpensive as they are. But for them to have what I would call a 15-year runway, 20-year, maybe 30, to get their wines to the point it is now from where it was only making brandy and harvesting it at whatever bricks, didn't matter.
That's huge.
Is astounding. It's an astounding thing. Where would you tell people to start with Israeli wine? What should they try? Where should they go? What do you recommend first?
Oh, gosh. Well, I think they should, if they want to have some kind of history in a glass kind of thing, I would go to some of the pioneers of this new modern revolution in winemaking for Israel. I would go to producers like Zion Winery, which it morphed into Zion Winery, but it was originally kind of the first winery that was founded in 1848. A rabbi in Jerusalem founded it, and it eventually became Zion Winery, and its offshoot sister winery called 1848 Winery, which is run by the Galena Shore family and has been for a very, very long time, since the beginning. Also, then, of course, going to Carmel Winery, and this is the winery that in 1882, Edmund Rothschild, I think we know that guy, we know that family, we know their wines. He came down to Israel and created Carmel because he believed that Israel had such great potential, especially with Bordeaux varietals. And he was freaking right. And those wines are absolutely delightful. I really enjoy Carmel's wines. Those are fantastic. There's just so many great wineries doing really exciting things, doing wonderful, sustainable things for the planet.
I mean, that's a great start. I mean, one of the things too, it's better to give a couple options at first, not to overwhelm. No,
I want to overwhelm.
No, I know. Well, it's an overwhelming thing because when you're in a place like this, it is overwhelming. So in Armenia, this is easy. There are, I am right now looking at these wines. I just Googled to make sure I was right on the price. Guys, there's a winery called Zulal, Zulal. I'm looking at this. You can get some of these bottles for $15 a piece, $16 a piece. The Arni Red is $16, and the Zulal Voskihat, which is, and don't let these names, don't let these grapes, don't let that stuff intimidate you. It's a $14.99 bottle. You guys, I cannot even believe. Do you know what it takes to grow these wines? These are like 170-year-old vines on a cliff that donkeys have to pull the damn thing down. They have to go in a container ship. Armenia is a landlocked country. It's got to go up through Georgia, out through the Black Sea, through the Mediterranean, out the world, and get to you. And it's $14.99. And this wine is screamingly good.
I will say the value for some of these regions, it's insane when you're drinking wines from the birthplace of frickin' wine and it's $15 for a knockout bottle. I do have a question though. Have you drunk Armenian wines outside of Armenia?
Now I have quite a bit. Yeah, now I have.
Do you find a difference because it has to travel so far and because you're not in the magic of that land?
Well, I mean, I would equate it to Guinness always tastes better in Ireland, but I would say that no, not in the case of like I've had, I've said it on the podcast many times, I call it the Greek wine effect, where you're sitting at a table next to your beautiful date and you're drinking wine and the wine's amazing and you're like, how much is this? And they're like, it's €1 a glass. And you're like, holy crap, everything's great. And then you bring that home and you're like, wow, this is shit. That's not this. No. This is a very different situation. This wine is tremendously, I don't recommend it without having it many times in many different places in many different ways. The other one, New Year's Eve is coming up. There's a wine called Kush. It's a sparkling. You can get it for like $16-17. It's made from wines on the edge of a war zone, 150-year-old vines. Big part of our next film. And it's it's almost criminal how cheap you can get these incredible bubbles. And so I think when we talked at the top of the pod about the death and rebirth, that is the theme here that we are talking about now. You are witnessing the rebirth of wine industries that had to lay dormant, in some cases for a millennia, in some cases for centuries, and they're back. And they're back alive. And if that doesn't help you believe in some higher power, then drink a bunch of this and look up at the stars, and you will. That's my kind of thing. And look, religion has brought us many things, positive and negative, but it's brought us wine. And I would say that's can't be a bad thing in itself. Claire, I hope you enjoy the rest of the holidays, and I hope that I get to have a glass with you very soon.
Oh, thank you. I hope that too.
Very good. Make sure you're subscribing to SOMM TV, because obviously we have the films we've mentioned. Claire's trip to Israel is going to be on SOMM TV early 2023. And check out some of these wines. We're going to put them in the show notes so you know what we talked about. And everybody be safe. Go to sommtv.com to gift what we believe is the best gift you can get somebody, especially if they're into wine or food or just love documentaries and stories. sommtv.com. You can gift it right now for you late panic buyers. SOMM TV. All right, everybody, be safe and enjoy the holidays.